We're your hosts, Sourish
and Kuan.
This is WaffleByte, where we bring you interesting bites about technology,
business,
and things that might change the world.
You can find links to our articles in the description.
But for now, enjoy the show.
This episode, we'll be discussing
work from home at nothing, the integration between your laptop and your phone, and
the epic rise of Visa from sending unsolicited credit cards in the mail to a money printing machine.
And the thought for the episode is, Meta are set to reveal a next generation of AR glasses soon. CTO Boz said, "In the domain of consumer electronics, it might be the most advanced thing that we've ever produced as a species."
So let's get straight into it.
Let's start off by talking about the company Nothing. So Nothing's founder and CEO, Carl Pei, publicly announced on X this week that he'll now require all Nothing employees to be in the office 5 days every single week, moving away from the hybrid model that they currently use in their London HQ. Now, he cites 3 reasons that fueled this decision. The first is that Nothing produces physical products, which makes it inherently incompatible with remote work.
I like this. It's a place where you can put products or put designs and have a discussion with the team.
And that clip is from 2 years ago, by the way.
I think that's a really valid reason, because when you're making physical products, presumably you're always prototyping and analysing the prototypes you've made and collaborating, and that's not really compatible with sitting on your desk at home and being in a Teams meeting, for example.
I have a part-time job and we're developing this physical product. And there's only 6 of us, but even just shipping the product between us and kind of managing stock and inventory between all of us is already really confusing and non-trivial. So I imagine at a company like Nothing with hundreds and hundreds of product designs and engineers and manufacturers and so on, that making physical products remotely would just be a huge unnecessary hassle.
I would also imagine that for Nothing, they would have tighter deadlines, wanting to push products out as soon as possible. And I don't think that's compatible with shipping things to each other very slowly and very expensively.
And that brings me on to the next point that Carl made in this tweet, which is that he calls Nothing an ambitious and fast-moving company. So he really cuts out this niche for Nothing, saying they hope to be a generation-defining company, as opposed to just being sold or absorbed by a bigger company. And it's this ambition and speed that Carl wants that he believes is not compatible with a remote-first company.
I suppose as a startup, you always have to be very ambitious. And in this case, Carl thinks that Nothing will become a generation-defining company. And as a result, you have to aim high and push very hard. Personally, however, I don't really think that Nothing will end up being a generation-defining company, simply because incumbent tech companies are so powerful.
And I think that's actually probably a good thing for Nothing, because these big tech companies like Google and Apple, they're going to have policies here and there. They're going to have layers of management everywhere, regardless of whether they want it or not. That's kind of just a fact of being a huge company. Whereas Nothing, by remaining at a slightly smaller scale, they can probably push through products faster and therefore be faster paced relative to these other companies. So probably by enforcing in-person work, Nothing can kind of fully step into this advantage of being able to work much faster than big tech. Finally, Carl Pei mentioned in his tweet that Nothing is focused on creativity and innovation, which they believe is their key to success in the crowded market, and that they need to create products with far fewer resources than most tech companies, and therefore creativity and innovation is kind of the leverage that they have over the big tech companies. And for me, this is the point that I actually agree with the most, because I really do think that when you have people like physically there, in person, in the same room with whiteboards and images and all of that, looking at the same things as each other, I think that's when your brainstorming is the most powerful, and when your creativity and innovation is the most powerful. Of course, you can't get work done in an environment where everyone's just throwing ideas at each other, but that's how you do innovate and kind of create creative designs, which is what the entire brand Nothing is all about. So I think this is a great point.
I would be willing to bet that most innovation happens in the office as opposed to at home, and that's partly because the office environment is hopefully more inspiring in terms of its decor, but also because in the office you get to interact with your colleagues, and hopefully they're inspiring people that you can collaborate with to come up with excellent new ideas and products. I think also that this reason is widely cited by tech companies and other companies in general as to why employees should return to the office to enhance collaboration, original creative work, and I think that's a very good reason for companies to suggest that.
I think it really does make sense because your rate of creativity and innovation, I think, is faster when you work directly with other people, because you kind of question ideas more and you kind of build this tower of ideas and creativity on each other. It's like you're almost placing a Jenga block and the other person places their block on top and so on, and it's just builds up the tower way faster than you ever could do remotely.
I think what's interesting is that you often see software engineers and coders be more able to work hybrid and work remotely, whereas people working on physical products have a much greater need for in-person contact and working in an office environment. And I think that's interesting because in technology, you have both hardware companies and software companies, but the policies are vastly different for these different companies because of the different demands of the products that they make.
Whenever nothing works on any of their products, it's the synergy between hardware and software that's important. So I feel like if the hardware team are forced to work in the office, then it only makes sense for the software team to also be forced to work in the office and kind of eliminate the barrier between these two teams to create such like a cohesive line of products. In this tweet, Carl was very polite and understanding because he knew this would be a controversial announcement and that some of his employees would want to leave after having now heard this, and he was perfectly amiable and fine with that. He emphasized the trust that Nothing has for their employees to manage their own time, and more importantly, which I think more companies should have, they would allow their employees to leave the office during the day whenever they need to, for example, to pick up a kid from school. And I think that's a policy that more companies should take on.
I agree fully because that's really good for especially parents, as you said. For example, you could have one parent leaving early and starting early, and another parent starting later and leaving later, and then you could be able to cover the school run. I also think that if, for example, you wanted to go to the gym midday when there's fewer people, but you want to make up the work hours later into the day, that's also a really good option for employees to have. And I think that this is a very good progression of hybrid working and flexible working that came out of the pandemic.
Our next story is about Windows, and the next major Windows feature update that's due later this year, dubbed 24H2. We have an official sneak peek as to what to expect. Now, I think, obviously, the best feature is actually the removal of a feature, Cortana, because it was so bad, and I'm glad to never ever have to see it again in my life.
I don't think anybody has ever had any success using Cortana. And I think even a while ago, the CEO of Microsoft said it was very bad himself, didn't he?
He did. He said they were all dumb as a rock. Now, onto a more serious note, what I think is the most exciting update is the upgrade to Phone Link. And this is the official Windows app that's used to connect your Android phone to Windows 11. It unlocks a whole suite of features, such as accessing your phone's photos and files, texting people, file sharing, making calls, and so on. This latest update brings more seamless integration between your two devices. But is this level of synergy between a smartphone and a laptop or computer actually useful?
For me, lots of things that I would do on my phone can be done on a computer in a native version. For example, WhatsApp has a web version and lots of other social media apps do as well. I think file sharing would be the most useful feature in this update because sometimes it can be challenging to put files on your phone onto your computer because you would have to send it to yourself or try.
But when would you actually want to do that?
Well, sometimes, for example, I took a picture and I would like this picture to be on my computer for various reasons. Maybe I want to edit it. Maybe I need to attach it somewhere. For example, if I'm applying for a bank account or something, I've got a picture of my passport that I want to upload. And it can just be challenging if it's on your phone, but you need it on your computer. And if it's not seamless, then it's just irritating.
Can't you just use a cloud service like Google Photos?
Yes, I could. But I think that has an extra step in that you have to go to the website and download it. Whereas in an ideal world, it would just sort of appear onto your computer from your phone, onto your storage, and you wouldn't have to download it and then upload it and do all sorts of things like that.
Yeah, I guess that's a valid point because actually, this new Windows feature update brings that exact feature. It brings that when you take a photo on your phone, it instantly appears as a notification on your computer, and you can just click that to access the photo. But I personally just don't see the purpose of this. For example, why do I ever need a clipboard? What am I copying from my phone to my computer? And if there's something that I want to copy, it's probably going to be in a messaging app like Discord or WhatsApp, which again is available on my computer. Or it's going to be in a browser, like a website. But again, I can access websites from my phone on my computer just using like any modern browser with sync features enabled. So I don't really understand this integration or this desire for integration between a smartphone and a laptop. And I never have understood this. And in fact, I used PhoneLink, which was previously known as Your Phone, and I used it quite a while back in the earlier days. And it certainly did live up to its promises. Like, it worked perfectly fine. It helped bridge the ecosystem gap that Apple has between their iPhones and Macs, but for Windows and Android phones. And PhoneLink arguably does a fantastic job at this, but I still don't really see the purpose. Clearly, Apple's biggest competitor in this space is Samsung, right? Samsung make pretty much all the same devices that Apple does, except, I guess, mainstream laptops. So Samsung would, of course, want to integrate their phones with Windows. And so Samsung, they work with Microsoft, and they partner quite often, actually, for a variety of things. But in this specific case, they partner with Microsoft to allow Samsung phone users to screen and mirror their phone onto their Windows machine and to access a clipboard and just to get more features than your average Android Windows user. And this makes it a perfect equivalent to Apple's offering.
I don't think Samsung's the first to try this. I think some Chinese manufacturers, such as Xiaomi and Huawei, have tried this already, and perhaps to differing success to Samsung. But I think the key thing here is that it's just a tiny bit more effort to set this up compared to, as we'll talk about, I'm sure later, Apple's ecosystem, where perhaps it's just the barrier to entry is just slightly lower. And I think the reason that's important is because if the barrier of entry is high, then few people actually use this feature. So although it works perhaps just as well as the Apple feature, you end up with fewer people using it, and people can't benefit from it as much because it's just simply slightly more difficult to use.
But does this justify the fact that Apple's ecosystem is always so hyped and often cited as the reason for purchasing Apple products? Is it really that much better than everything else? Samsung has a superb ecosystem, and as you said, if you're willing to just deal with maybe a touch of jank or maybe a few minutes of setup as soon as you get your new phone or your new laptop, then you can almost choose like any device that exists and still find useful integrations between that device and the rest of your technology. So is the reason that Apple is so successful with their ecosystem because they don't let anything work on other manufacturers' devices? For example, the Apple Watch or AirPods, they don't work very well on Android devices. Is that the reason Apple's ecosystem is so successful? As opposed to the fact that, for example, Apple have things work better on their end, which, as we said, is not entirely true.
Personally, I still believe that Apple has a better ecosystem overall in terms of their devices all do work seamlessly, and crucially, they work all the time. So sometimes I try to, when I have multiple laptops set up on Windows, I try to use Nearby Share, and often it doesn't work. Whereas with AirDrop, Apple's equivalent, it tends to work all of the time. So I think things like that is where the Apple ecosystem can be argued to be better. In addition, of course, Apple has many different devices, such as AirPods, which can seamlessly transfer between your MacBook and your phone, which can be useful for some people. I think the average consumer overthinks the importance of an ecosystem because the average consumer probably doesn't use it as much as they could. I think tech enthusiasts in particular are always talking about the Apple ecosystem as if it's something that's unmatched. And I think that for most people, they simply don't have the need to use a lot of the ecosystem features. And I think finally, it's important to perhaps realize that most average consumers won't be willing to deal with any jank that you talked about, and they would only be willing to use a feature if it works perfectly and is already set up for them.
To be fair, I think you raised a good point about AirDrop, for example, because whilst a lot of people would use Apple products like AirDrop or Apple Notes or whatever, I'm more likely to kind of use a product that I want to use. So I always never use AirDrop or never use Nearby Share. I'm always going to use a cloud provider instead, like Google Drive or OneDrive or that type of thing. And maybe that's just something that not many people do, and therefore my perspective just could be wrong in this case.
I think the point you made there is that for a average consumer, you're more willing to use a feature that's already set up for you or is mostly set up for you in the case of perhaps Samsung, where you still have to do something yourself. But for yourself as a tech enthusiast, you want to do things your own way, and that might not be the way that the ecosystem is intended to work. So I think from your perspective, you're not really taking advantage of the ecosystem and using it. And you can just do things your own ways, and perhaps it's more efficient for your workflow in particular. But I think for the average person that the ecosystem, if it's already set up for them, would be a more appealing option because they wouldn't want to set things up themselves.
A couple of days ago, Google announced that they're also getting involved in this space, not just Microsoft and not just Samsung. They recently launched or announced Google Essentials, which will be their Windows app to almost act as a sort of hub for Google services for Windows users. When it launches, it will initially contain access to Google Messages and Google Photos, but they also expect to allow Windows users to download and Play Store games on their computers, which is kind of a crazy idea to me because now all of a sudden, can you use your computer to compete in, for example, an online game against other people who are using a phone? That feels a bit dodgy to me.
Well, as a somewhat counter-argument to that point, I think you've always been able to play Android games on a computer if you took advantage of an emulator, for example. But I think the crucial thing about this is that your barrier to entry is now much lower if this goes through. I also think that this is partly because, as we see in Apple's case, the change to ARM processors increasingly on Windows devices has allowed for Android apps, which of course run on ARM processors, to run natively on ARM-equipped Windows laptops. And that's perhaps one reason why this is now being pushed and is possible.
I think it's hilarious that this competition now exists between the Windows Phone Link and Google's Essentials. And this is just so funny because they're relying on each other's operating systems, and yet they're not necessarily working together. They're developing their own app for Windows. And this is just crazy. Like, if they work together, they can probably create some sort of incredibly seamless solution, and yet they're not. But at least the competition between these two companies should lead to a faster rate of development.
Yes, it would be logical for them to work together, wouldn't it? I think that both these companies have such dominating presences in Microsoft's case, the desktop operating system market, and in Google's case, the phone market. And if they just work together, they could create something that was much better. But of course, Google has their Chromebooks, and they perhaps would prefer if more people used Chromebooks, and the Chromebooks worked well with Android devices. So I think there's some friction that keeps them from working together. I also think that should they work together more tightly, certainly some regulators would be interested, and that could be problematic for both companies moving forward. Today, I'm going to be talking about payment processing and Visa, which dominates the payment processing market. So, Sourish, have you ever thought about what happens when you tap your card or your phone to pay for something that you've bought?
I've tried to think about what happens, but I've never got my head around it because it's such a massive system around the world, and I kind of just have no clue what actually happens.
Yeah, it's really complicated, actually, and it's something that we take for granted these days. But to understand how Visa came to be, we need to go back to the 1950s. Companies started allowing customers to use cards to buy things on credit. So what would happen is you would be issued an airline card or a card from a department store, and you could buy things with a credit line, such that you could buy things with the money you didn't already have. And this was wildly popular and boosted customer loyalty among merchants. Now the problem is, you could only use, say, your airline card to purchase airline tickets and spend money at airlines, and you could only use your department store card at department stores. You couldn't use one card for everything. But this guy called Joseph Williams, who was at Bank of America at the time, and Bank of America had a big California operation, decided that he would try and start a general purpose card.
With only one credit card, the Bank America card, you can charge almost anything, almost anywhere. The Bank America card gives you instant credit from Boston to Honolulu, from London to Bangkok. The Bank America card will soon be coming to Southern Ohio.
So Joseph Williams started what was called Bank America card in 1958. And he tried to solve this chicken and egg problem where if you had no vendors accepting the card, customers wouldn't be willing to use this card. But on the other hand, if no customers were using the card, then no vendors would then accept it. So you sort of had this very unfortunate situation. And in order to solve this, they actually sent unsolicited credit cards to 65,000 people in a place called Fresno in California. And the reason they chose this place was because they had a 45% market share, and they were obviously very dominant in California, so they could negotiate with lots of the merchants so that they would accept the card that they just sent to 65,000 people unsolicited. And they had a credit limit of between $300 and $500. So you could essentially spend between $300 and $500 on any merchant that would accept the card, and you didn't have to pay it back immediately. You had a 30-day grace period, and they pioneered the interest rate model that credit cards use today, such that you don't have to pay off your credit card after every month. You could instead keep a balance, and that would obviously accumulate interest. But if you didn't have enough cash on hand, you didn't have to pay off your credit card.
I sure like the convenience of my Bank AmeriCard.
So Bank of America continued to dropping these across California, where they, of course, had a large market share.
Here they were having a sale, and there I was without any cash.
And by October of 1959, following year, they actually had distributed over 2 million cards to the people in this region.
But I had my Bank AmeriCard, so when the girl asked what I wanted, that, I said. And 2 of those. And charge it. Fine, she said.
And around 20,000 merchants began to accept the Bank AmeriCard.
Boy, did I get a bargain. Thanks to my Bank AmeriCard.
People on the receiving end of these unsolicited credit cards, some of them were delighted because they thought this was free money. They thought they could just spend money on buying whatever they wanted, and they would have to worry about paying it back much later. However, the problem with this was that those financially irresponsible individuals who thought this was indeed free money would be unable to repay the money that they spent on the credit card. So, Bank of America, in its other lending businesses, had a delinquency rate of about 4%. Delinquency is, of course, where you fail to pay back the loan that you borrowed. But in this instance, the Bank AmeriCard had a 22% delinquency rate. And this was obviously highly problematic because if people can't pay back the money that they spent on the credit card, as a bank who's lending out the money, you're losing money. So across this operation, Bank of America, they lost over $8 million because of delinquencies, and they had further losses because of their marketing costs. So overall, they lost $20 million in total. Joseph William, who was the man behind this Bank AmeriCard, got fired. What was even worse for Bank of America was that people with bad intentions and criminals and fraudsters realized that some of these cards that would be sent out to customers unsolicited didn't have the customer's name on it yet. So if they stole these cards, they would still be valid even though they weren't issued to a particular person. These criminals would steal these cards and spend the money. Because the customers of these credit cards were held liable even in cases of fraud, this generated massive uproar in both politicians and journalists because these fraudsters were running rampant with cards that hadn't been credited to customers yet, and the customers were being held responsible. Anyways, executives at Bank of America, after firing Joseph Williams, realized that this credit card idea had potential. They then tried to turn this Bank AmeriCard program around, and by 1961, it had become profitable. And actually, what I found really interesting was that Bank of America hid the fact that these credit cards were profitable to inhibit competition, because of course, just a couple of years ago, they had tremendous media outrage about this program. However, until 1966, this was no longer possible because this program was simply too profitable. Now, at the time, there were certain regulations that stated you couldn't expand your card issuing outside of your state. So what Bank of America did was that they started licensing the Bank AmeriCard to other banks to lend to customers outside of California, which was the state that they were based in. The other banks would handle lending money to customers as part of the credit system and the credit card. However, Bank of America would handle the transactions with the vendors. D. Hock, which was a manager at another bank trying to issue Bank AmeriCards, realized that this aggressive expansion was problematic because interbank transactions were going poorly. So he persuaded the executives at Bank of America to allow him to form an independent new alliance of Bank America card issuing banks. And this was formed in 1970. However, outside of the United States, Bank of America continued to license Bank America cards and their processing infrastructure to other banks wanting to issue their own credit cards. So for example, in the UK, we had Barclays card, which was based on the Bank America card program. However, of course, it was branded by Barclays, and in other regions of the world, this was done similarly. In 1976, these international banks who were using the Bank America card network decided to come together and decide on a branding that would be suitable for cards all around the world.
Why is Bank America card becoming Visa?
So they eventually formed Visa and Visa International.
Did you know it's called Visa because D. Hock thought that the term Visa sounded the same in every language and was instantly recognizable by quite a lot of the population.
I think what D. Hock was successful at was creating a brand that is widely recognized around the world, which is testament to what he's done to create this global business.
They asked me what I thought we ought to do, and I said, well, I think a very small number of people ought to go away, isolate themselves from everything, and address one question. If anything in the world was possible, what would be an ideal organization to create the world's premier system for the exchange of value?
Visa, ever since it was formed, has had a significant market share. At the present moment, it has about a third of the global transaction volume on cards. And Visa's business is fundamentally about connecting banks, businesses, and financial institutions to create this payment processing infrastructure that works all around the world and creating rules and guidelines for credit card issuers, but also merchants, so that the customer experience of using a Visa card is as good as it can be. And in fact, at one point, it was the most valuable financial services company in the world, but at the moment, it's second just to JP Morgan Chase at over $500 billion in market capitalization. And what I thought was interesting was that Bank of America, which, if you remember, was the origins of Visa, has a market cap of about $300 billion. So Visa makes their money by taking essentially around 25 cents for every $100 transacted through its network. So this is not a huge amount, but if a business is expecting being paid $100, then Visa taking a bit is kind of annoying for them, I suppose. What's more is that if you use a credit card, they often incur very high swipe fees, up to 3%. Most of this goes to the bank because banks often issue credit cards with lots of perks, and this swipe fee is what the bank used to pay for these perks. And vendors, of course, get quite irritated because that's quite a large sum of money that's been taken away from them, and some vendors have suggested it's their second highest cost, even before rent and right after the cost for human labour. What's perhaps quite predictable is that antitrust regulators started taking an interest in Visa because it had become very dominant and had tremendous market power. MasterCard, which is a competitor to Visa, but also in some ways a partner in crime, also was subject to antitrust investigations.
America's consumers have simply lost out. They have lost the benefit of vigorous competition between the two largest credit card networks, which means that they have not enjoyed the innovation that competition brings.
Some of these antitrust investigations have gone on for a very long time, and actually one was settled just 4 months ago.
You know, Visa is like, I guess, kind of akin to Walmart from last episode, where the initial focus was just to do something new and do something better and focus on the customers. But now it's transformed into this huge company that most people don't pay any attention to, and yet it's kind of a backbone to society, and they have so much power. Just like Oracle, for example. Almost no one's heard of Oracle, and yet they are absolutely huge and have so much control.
Yes, and some companies such as Visa prefer staying under the radar, but it has such tremendous impact on our everyday lives because when we buy something, we're essentially sending money to Visa. But Visa, having had this tremendous market power, is they're looking at other payment processing methods that could compete with their model of essentially swiping your card. Moving forward, I think Visa not only is mindful of competition from MasterCard and American Express. American Express, of course, lends money itself, which is unlike Visa because Visa doesn't lend money, it just handles the transactions. But also from fintech companies trying to bypass their network and offer more competitive solutions to businesses without Visa taking this 25-cent per $100 fee. In addition, regulators have demanded Visa to reduce the amount they take on payments that people make. And they have also demanded that the swipe fee, which includes the money that goes to the bank for allowing perks on credit cards, to be reduced. But overall, Visa has a tremendous potential because of their market power and because of the fact that the infrastructure can handle much more transactions without incurring a lot of additional cost. They have tremendously high profit margins and will continue to be very successful in the near future.
For the first Snappy Bit today, I'd like to talk about Replit. And Replit is this website that essentially gives you an editor to code in pretty much any language in any web browser, and it syncs across different devices, and you can collaborate with other people, like work. It's almost like Google Docs, but for coding. You can almost kind of think of it like VS Code, but for websites. And if you ever coded before, you probably heard of Replit. Now, it was founded in 2016, and I was a relatively early adopter to it because it was such a good product, right? Because it delivered this amazing online experience for free. You don't have to download anything. You can have as many code environments or REPLs, they call it, as you want. And it was great. And it didn't have that many features. It was very not feature rich, but it had enough to like code, and it was an awesome app. But then, over the past few years, they've just made it worse and worse and worse. So first off, it's now bloated. It's incredibly bloated. It's just a very slow website. It's full of random buttons and icons everywhere, and I don't like it. And then they also decided to increase the price of the premium option. So a few years ago, I actually used to be a paid subscriber because I thought the premium option was good value and offered quite a lot of benefits. But then what they decided to do is they decided to remove some features from the free version that were like almost essential. For example, private REPLs, which now means anyone can see your REPL, which is not good. And so they removed that from the free version. And then they doubled the price of the premium version to $240 a year, which is crazy. And I was not going to pay that. And now recently, in fact, just yesterday or 2 days ago, I got an email saying that they've now updated it again. And this means that as a free user, I can only have 3 REPLs. Now, I probably have a few hundred already, and those will at least stay where they are, but it now means anyone now creating new REPLs from about next week onwards, they can only create up to 3 more new REPLs, which I think is just crazy. It goes against the whole idea of this company in the first place, and you now have to go ahead and pay for their premium subscription to get any value out of this, and you can't even collaborate on the free account, which, like, it removes any point of even touching REPL. This is where REPL came from. They probably don't, like, they're still profitable whether they give this feature for free or not. And I'm just annoyed now.
This is a textbook example of a company previously backed by venture capital funding, trying to gain as much users as possible. And now they realize that they should probably start making money. And so they're paywalling features and jacking up the prices to maximize their profits and return shareholder value, etc. And I think that you're stuck in this and you're very annoyed. Very understandable, but it is part of what we take for granted these days, which is free services paid for by user data in some cases, and then paywalled features that you actually want to use.
Yeah, we've seen this time and time again, like with OnePlus. All of their hardcore enthusiasts from day one, all of them hate the company now. And we're going to keep seeing this, as you say, because of the way startups and venture capital funding works.
I do think, though, that people need to get accustomed to paying for services that they enjoy using and want to use, because you can't have everything for free. It's got to come from somewhere. And
I think what we need is we need pricing models that are very customizable, such that you only pay for exactly what you want and no more.
On a more positive note, I want to talk about competition, particularly competition in the mobile processor industry, and that's for laptops and tablets, etc. Just 5 or 7 years ago, Intel was by far the dominant player in this industry, and they essentially had a monopoly of any decent chip that you might want to put in a laptop. So I remember in 2017 buying a laptop with an Intel processor, and it had a meager 2 cores, and I thought that was ridiculous. But there weren't really better options that were suitably priced. Fast forward to the present, and we have 4 competitors in the mobile processor landscape. And in fact, Intel, which used to milk their 14 nanometer fab and refused to essentially innovate, now has AMD, which is fellow x86 mobile processor maker, who in some cases have much better processors, and Apple Silicon, which is ARM-based, of course, and Qualcomm, which have just recently released their ARM-based processor for Windows laptops. And actually, Sourish, you've benefited from this competition because you've just bought a shiny new laptop. So tell us about that.
Yeah, so I just bought HP's flagship lineup, the Spectre X360, and it was on a huge deal. And I suspect a big reason it was on such a huge deal is the anticipation of the next generation of processors, which are starting to be rolled out now, and some already have. It's anticipation of those processors being so good that they kind of need to get rid of all of this year's stock, because no one's going to buy this year's laptop when next year's laptop exists. And so this fierce competition kind of seems to lead to huge deals.
Yes, and as you alluded to there, the consumer ultimately benefits from increased competition, and it's something that we should be very pleased about. And certainly the regulators who try to curb monopolies and anti-competitive behaviour should also see this and continue to do what they do, certainly in the EU, but also in the United States, to increase competition across all areas of technology in particular, where gatekeeping tends to happen more regularly.
The thought from the beginning of the episode was, Meta are set to reveal a next generation of AR glasses soon. CTO Boz said, in the domain of consumer electronics, it might be the most advanced thing that we've ever produced as a species. So, my first question, Kuankuan, is the AR dream still going strong?
I think the Meta CTO was using a bit of a hyperbole there, because I don't think that the AR glasses that they're about to release are the most advanced thing that we've ever produced as a species. I think that's going a bit too far.
I agree.
But I do think that there's an increased focus recently on AR and VR devices, mainly because Apple decided to throw their version of this wearable device into the mix with their Vision Pro. And as a result, the average consumer is probably giving this a bit more attention. And I think that if the new Meta glasses can be useful as a product for consumers, it could be a next step in the AR
But it's
dream.
been in the news recently that Apple's Vision Pros aren't selling as well as they hoped. And in fact, Meta, they were actually going to release a competitor to the Vision Pro, a direct competitor, in 2027. And that project's now been scrapped, probably because Meta have seen how not so successful Apple's Vision Pro is, especially with the general consumer.
Yeah, I think it's quite easy to realize why the Apple Vision Pro hasn't been as successful as Apple might have hoped it would be. Of course, it's very expensive at over $3,000 or pounds. But also, it's quite heavy, the battery life isn't great, and you have to be tethered to a battery pack. And the apps that support the Vision Pro aren't as numerous as it probably should be. But I think that what's important about the Vision Pro is that it exists to sort of condition the public to accepting the fact that people might be wearing these in the future, to accept the benefits that VR and AR could potentially have. And I think it's a small stepping stone to what Apple might envision to be a future where lots more people have AR and VR devices. And I think that Meta is also envisioning a similar future, and they're taking their own steps towards this.
See, I think we just need a huge cultural shift before we're ready for VR and AR devices, because they're still really new. We still don't see people use them. And if we do, it's only ever in the context of gaming, like by yourself in a room, and not out and about and wearing it, or wearing it in family occasions and things like that, or like Apple suggested you might want to do. And even like, for example, whenever I see my mum plug in her electric car, I'm still blown away by the fact that she's plugged in a car. Even though I'm young and I've grown up with electric cars, it's still crazy for me to see that. So I think it's going to be a very long time before we're culturally accepting of AR and VR devices, even if the technology is only a few years away.
Yeah, I think that's a really good point. And also, we need, as a species, to consider, should we want to be immersing ourselves in the metaverse as opposed to in the real world? Because people are increasingly lonely because of social media usage, etc. And perhaps we should be interacting with other humans more, as opposed to be interacting with either fake people on in the metaverse, or perhaps calling each other in the metaverse as opposed to meeting in person. So I think we need to consider that as well. And I don't think that will help the shift that these companies want to a world where AR and VR are more prevalent.
What would it take for you to go ahead and purchase some AR glasses? Because we already have some pretty good AR glasses from people or companies such as Extrareal and Rokit. But what do you want to see before you go ahead and purchase one?
What I want to see is that it behaves and feels more like real glasses. So currently, because of the fact that they need a computer and they need battery, they're often quite heavy, they're very expensive, and they don't feel as comfortable to wear as a normal pair of glasses. So I think once they fix that, that would remove a hurdle for me to adopting one of these devices. And even though perhaps the functionality might not be brilliant, if it can do basic things such as play music or tell me my to-do list or my calendar or things like that, and it feels like a normal pair of glasses, I think that's still worth considering.
The thing that would kind of make me very much consider switching is if, for example, the monitor on my computer just dies and therefore I need to go ahead and spend £200 on a new monitor. But instead of spending £200 on a new monitor, what if I spend those £200 buying myself some AR glasses, which also can act as a monitor for my computer, as well as come with the other functionalities such as voice calling and watching movies and things on the go. And that's the trigger that would almost certainly make me buy some AR glasses.
Yeah, I think there are lots of exciting possibilities when you integrate a digital environment with a real environment, which is what you do with AR. But I think that we are still quite a long way from achieving that.
Yeah, this is just a stepping stone, I think, until we get to real, I guess, cyborgs, before we get to the situation where we can all install a Neuralink chip in our brain and communicate with computers that way. And I think this is that stepping stone, which is going to be available in the near future, as opposed to the very, very long future.
Thank you for listening. We'll be back next Monday with a new episode.
And remember to follow us on X at the WaffleByte. That's _WaffleByte. See you there.
Bank AmeriCard, today's way to pay, presents
Yuletide presents, roasted pheasants, electric choo-choo trains,
Fur-lined mittens, fluffy kittens, sweet candy canes.